Our entire existence here is just LARPing.
Omni, you have no idea.
So, I don't know if this is an unpopular take, but I'm not a big fan of Glitch. Like, not in the moral high horse type of way. I don't have some weird personal beef with them for putting their stuff in theaters early. I just don't really click that much with most of their output. You know, I thought Gaslight District was cool, Genevieve was fine, Gameaverse was mid. I've tried watching Murder Drones on maybe 4 different occasions, and I've never had the strength to get past episode 3. It's just so annoyingly okay to me. And then there's their older stuff, which, I'm sorry, man, I can't find it in me to give a shit. So there's only one show from them I was ever really a fan of, The Amazing Digital Circus. And I'm not gonna lie, a lot of that came down to the creators, since I am a longtime fan of anything Gooseworks. I got introduced to them through Elaine Gets Adopted, which is kinda like watching Fire Walk With Me as your first David Lynch, but their style was so distinct and interesting, I just had to see more of what this person could do, and that led me down a massive rabbit hole, since it turns out there's way more they could do than I initially thought. Like, normally when I look into artists, they're great at this one specific thing that defines their whole career online, but with Goose, it felt like the opposite, since she's just never stuck to doing one single thing well. She works in 2D animation, 3D animation, hand-drawn, motion tweens, music, webcomics, unnaturally good shitposting. I know it just sounds like I'm sucking them off, but seriously, she has so many talents that feel like they're at their best for her most ambitious projects, and it seemed like the bigger they went, the better they got, so I was really excited when I heard she was teaming with Glitch to do a full series. I didn't know what to expect, since most of her shit's kinda off the walls by design, plus the one time she actually tried a story, she canned it right as it was getting good, but I wanted to give the benefit of the doubt, since it's clear she works so hard on whatever she does, and even if she's not versed with deeper storytelling, she knows how to get some big emotional impacts. I watched Dento Takes the Stairs once and I fucking disintegrated. So I had a lot of hopes going into it, and once the pilot was out, I thought it was good. I like the premise, a Harlan Ellison sort of romp about trapped souls forced to go on adventures from a digital ringmaster. Sounds like a setup Goose would have fun with. She'd keep the baby eating option. That and the jokes were good, the cast was fun, the style was sick, I love all the squash and stretch, but there was also a slight lack of polish in the story and pacing. It was obviously the start of something, so I didn't want to go too hard with it, and a couple moments really stood out to me, like the ending theme, which just... So it had me hooked for sure, but I felt like I needed some more before I could really make a judgment call. I was glad there was room to just have a normal conversation, though, with how hostile the Murder Drones fandom was, and yeah, no, I wasn't gonna finish that sentence. I can't even begin to tell you how over it is. To say I was shocked at the reception doesn't really do it justice, since I was legitimately unnerved at the level of popularity. It didn't make sense to me. I mean, I wanted it to be big and expected at least the numbers Murder Drones was getting, but I never thought it'd be the type of thing I heard my brain-rotted younger brother referencing. It was almost a little uncomfortable, especially when I looked at the Digital Circus poster I bought, and then once it started getting slop videos, I was just taken out, since I always associated that type of shit with baby content, so thinking of something made by the creator of the Darley boxcar getting that reputation, it didn't really compute with me. I guess what happened was it did such a good job capturing the aesthetic it couldn't help getting fans of the Jake Neutron variety, even though it was clearly wearing it ironically like most Goose stuff is, and mixed with the oversaturation of indie pilots lately, I think maybe it's had an effect on how people see it. Oh, who am I fucking kidding? There's no maybe about it. You don't get Jack's Toy to 50 million views without people seeing you differently. Me personally, though, I never quite meshed with that side of the fandom, since I wasn't a Glitch fan or an indie fan or a slop fan, I was a Gooseworks fan. So no matter how big the show got or how many follicles on Jax's foreskin I could see as the budget expanded, I always thought of it as, I don't know, smaller. The grandness of it never caught up to me, and that's probably why I feel so casual talking about it now, despite just getting back from watching the finale and probably the worst theater experience of my life. Like, I don't want to hear anything about how unfair it was. You had to be mentally unwell to get through that, because if you weren't already, you were going to be by the end. But I still couldn't change from that view I always had of it. You know, from my perspective, Digital Circus had always been just the first big piece in the GCU, and even if I tried not to think that way initially, I probably would have by the end, since man, this thing is kinda rough. Like, my thoughts weren't as structured before, since for a while I was just sort of binging the thing when a new episode came and leaving it there, but for the finale I thought I should go through it all in one big sitting to prepare, and I realized I don't think I actually like it. I know that sounds weird when I just got done hyping up Goose and how I was watching the show whenever something new came out, but honestly, looking back, aside from the fact I just wasn't that engaged when I was watching it casually, I also remember I let a lot of things slide, since in the months between episodes I'd forget the specifics and figure I was misremembering when something didn't get the focus or payoff I was kinda hoping for. So in other words, I gaslit myself since I couldn't be fucked to go back every time a new episode was out, but I've done it now, and I sorta regret it. I mean, there's still a lot to like. I've always loved Goose's style of humor, even if the dialogue's not nearly as good as the visual gags, which I kinda expected. The animation's extremely fluid and polished. It's probably my favorite looking glitch show minus Gaslight District. Oh, and have I mentioned the music? Because the music makes me ejaculate. So everything I thought Goose would nail, she did. But everything I was worried she wouldn't... Shit, my comedy mask. I guess it's time for sad boy hours. I think my first big problem with the amazing... Okay, I'm not saying the whole thing every time. What's the acronym? TADC? Yeah, not using that. I think my first problem with Circus is one I've kinda had with most of Goose's projects, but never saw as that big an issue before, and that's the main lead's just not very interesting beyond their design. Like, in shorts, it's less intrusive since they're usually more about the worlds, so Elaine and Runmo just being curious little goobers gets the job done, but Circus is explicitly a more character-focused show, and it goes on for way longer, so there's not much excuse for just how average Pomni is. You know, at first I was more forgiving, her being the POV as the newest member and all, even if her reaction's so textbook she literally goes, is this a dream? I bet this is a dream. Which I hate with a passion, but what I hate even more is that Pomni doesn't just not go on to be an interesting character once the shock wears off, she somehow gets simpler. And there wasn't that much to stand on to begin with, so it's sort of like seeing a caterpillar go into a cocoon and come out as a worm, since at the start, she had something. It wasn't much. Okay, it was just anxiety, but you could work with that. I like anxious characters. The more panic attacks, the better. No, not you. You'll get your turn. But yeah, Pomni had plenty of room to grow from there. And in episode 2, she almost starts getting there with a bit about her feeling like she's falling into darkness that isn't brought up for most of the episode and gets resolved way too fast at the end through characters she still hasn't formed a connection with. But then after that, it's diddly squat. She gets almost nothing else I'd call major character traits. I guess being generous, you could say she's understanding and reasonable, but that's just me digging. It's not like those define her, at least when she's not having a therapy session with other characters. Really, she's just anxious, and even that's only occasional when she's not acting normal, which gets more and more common as she integrates to the circus. So like I said, she basically devolves from how she was in the pilot to be less intriguing. And the suckiest part is that the rest of the cast aren't that much different. Think about it. How much does, say, Zubul change by the end of the series? None at all, right? They're an independent fuck you rebel who tells it straight at the start, and they're exactly the same when you get to the end. Nothing about them fundamentally changes. Now look at the others. Kinger, nutcase who's more reasonable in the dark. Ragatha, people-pleasing self-deprecator. Gangle, emotionally fragile pushover. None of these profiles change at all by the last episode. They might get a little more comfortable with themselves, like Gangle coming to accept her insecurities, but that's about it. And if you're wondering how that's possible when we have 9 episodes featuring these characters, it's because while they all have problems you'd think would be the focus of episodes, specifically about getting over those problems, that never ends up happening since, well, they're all missing one thing to get them started. A catalyst. You know, something that gives them a reason to overcome it. The thing that drives pretty much all growth in stories, since otherwise why would people change? I mean, just for the most blatant example I can think of, Saw. The catalyst of those movies is Jigsaw putting people in traps because, I don't know, they miss their son too much, and they need to win through getting over it or dying. That's what a catalyst does. It gives motivation. But the characters in Circus don't have them, meaning all we get for most of the story is a bunch of setups that linger, sit around for a while, and then maybe, just maybe, they'll get paid off with a brief therapy sesh where after spoon-feeding the message to them in as blunt of terms as possible, they'll think, wow, I think this is really what I needed to start my path to change. That's what happens with Zubul's body dysmorphia, Gangle's hatred of herself, Pomni's anxiety. It's a never-ending loop of the same thing happening over and over, and I don't know about you, but to me, that's pretty unsatisfying. Especially when you factor in the one character who does get development, Mr. Jaxbox himself, whose arc just kinda naturally dunks on everyone else's because he actually has a catalyst. His self-preserving funny guy shtick leaves him isolated and imploding, so although he tries to fight it, he eventually lets Pomni in since he knows he can't keep this up forever. It's not a complex arc, I wouldn't call it amazing, but it's well executed. So it's honestly no wonder to me he got most of the focus later, since he's the only one I can say that about. Or well, that and most of the time he's the only one causing the main thing every story needs, which is conflict. There has to be real, genuine conflict either between the cast or against them for anything to change. And when you look at the cast of Circus, none of them are doing shit to cause it without Jax. Seriously. Like, I hate to list them out again, but Kinger's a nut so he stays in his fort, Zubul's a rebel so they keep to themselves, Gangle's a wimp who hardly complains, Ragatha's too agreeable to start a fight, and Pomni's stuck in her own head. If it weren't for Jax around to stir things up and annoy them, there'd be no natural conflict since they're all too docile or unobtrusive to do it themselves. Shit, I remember in the pilot Pomni left Ragatha to potentially die, and the way that left an awkward air, I thought it'd lead to a discussion about some built-up resentment or whatever, but no, the minute episode 2 starts, Ragatha's all, oh, don't worry about it, buddy, we're still good. And somehow that's the fucking end of it, for real. Without Jax, this would be every scene. It's why the episodes he's not involved in are the most peaceful, but also the most aimless. He's the only one willing to push buttons and bring them out of their comfort zone, something that also points to another thing the show's missing: goals. Since if a character's not looking to do something, how can they run into conflicts that stop them until they can grow enough to beat it? Having goals is about the most basic thing necessary for any narrative, and yet for most of its episodes, Circus kinda insists it shouldn't have one, since there's an obvious goal from episode 1, try to get out, but after the pilot, Pomni basically gives up any dream of it like the others, so until the possibility decides to literally walk up to them in episode 7, no one ever tries to do anything. Okay, there's the goal of Pomni adjusting to the circus, but that's not something she and the others work at. It just sort of naturally happens by virtue of her being there. There's nothing to give it a sense of urgency that keeps you invested. It's just a bunch of lazing around waiting for stuff to happen. And look, to be fair to Goose, I can see how we got here. Something a lot of writers worry about is making sure their characters naturally take as long as they do to win, since if they're too proactive, the story might end too quickly. My favorite example of this is how when the author of Beastars switched Haru and Legoshi species and genders for What If, the story finished in like 5 seconds. That's clearly what Goose was trying to avoid here, given how if the cast was just a little more questioning, they probably would have realized Kinger's a programmer who goes sane in the dark and used him like they do in episode 8. So to keep that from happening, they had to be utterly hopeless and kinda dumb. And what that leads to is a breezy tone where the cast can just chill and be social until shit gets real, but the problem with that is it feels empty. I mean, characters trying to make sense of a world they feel trapped in is interesting, but the rules of the world itself are hardly ever the focus, and there still needs to be something that pushes the story along. We need to know we're going somewhere. Otherwise, it's just trauma dumping without any real point, which a lot of this feels like. Like, most of the time whenever Jax is gone, it's just blunt conversation, and it sort of makes me yearn for him, since sure, I don't know where the shit he starts is going, if anywhere, but at least when Jax gets people to fight, I know there's momentum. He gets the gears of potential change moving, which is more than I can say for the one who should be doing that, at least a little bit, Kane. And you know, that seriously bugs me, cause it's the polar opposite of his character's inspiration. See, Goose is pretty open about the fact she got some ideas for Circus from I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is this really integral piece of horror sci-fi. You've probably heard of it before. It's a classic for a reason, and seeing as it's about people getting stuck in a simulation with a sadistic AI, it's not hard to see who Kane's kinda based on: Am. Now, there's a bunch of differences between the two that set them apart, mostly because Am's a malicious amalgamation of human hatred, while Kane's just trying his best at making fun adventures and failing, but the thing I want to focus on here is something Am adds to the story that Kane just doesn't: agency. Because Am's whole thing is that he wants to keep torturing people with shit that reminds them of their trauma, so the only way to beat him is by confronting that trauma. I.e., he makes conflicts for the cast and they're incentivized to solve them since they don't want to go on being tortured. But Kane's adventures don't have any of that bite, since like I said, he's not doing shit maliciously. His only goal is making fun adventures, so for most episodes, the cast problems feel completely separate from whatever they're doing. Like, in the episode Zubul mentions their body dysmorphia, it's not from any sort of trigger caused by the adventure, they're just explaining it to Kane while the others go on an unrelated spooky mansion quest. It feels completely disconnected from the rest of the episode, and that's how it is for most of them. The adventures don't do anything to naturally bring out the cast's insecurities or issues, they're just vaguely themed window dressing for casual conversation. In fact, there's only one episode I can think of where that doesn't happen, episode 4, and even then that's only for Gangle and sorta Pomni. The rest of the cast are still fucking around because the setting does nothing for almost any of them aside from her, which by the way is still pretty underwhelming since, yeah, her being a manager tells us she overvalued her job to cover up feeling like her dreams were behind her, but that's really all it does. It just shows us a problem of hers without any attempt at resolution, and she's not motivated to face it since, first of all, she chose to be there, so there's no conflict of her trying to get away or overcome it, and secondly, there's nothing pushing her to overcome it, and she doesn't. So it isn't as much a story as just a lore dump. And that's kinda how it is for everyone. Does learning Ragatha had a controlling mom amount to anything? No. Does Kinger have to battle with the trauma of losing his wife? No. Again, the only one whose backstory plays any role in their current arc is Jax, and what do you know? He's only willing to face it when Pomni forces him to, since what do you know? Most people aren't gonna face their deep personal trauma if something doesn't force them to. And minus a few minutes in episode 8, Kane doesn't force them. So basically what we've got is a cast going on adventures where completing them doesn't matter since nothing happens if they fail, they mean nothing thematically since they're mostly just set dressing, and when they do have some relevance, they never lead to a payoff earned by confronting them. Remind me what the stakes are again? I think the obvious thing missing here is a sense of threat, cause in No Mouth, if the characters lost their respective challenges, Am kept torturing them, which added stakes to the idea of them trying to escape or beat him. But in Circus, it's made a point that almost nothing matters since Kane doesn't care how they play the games as long as they play them, so they're never engaged with the adventures they're on. Episode 2 flirts with the idea of how NPCs are affected, which kinda hints at a conflict debating how much their pain matters, but once we learn that those characters get reset every episode, it's never even brought up again. I thought they'd keep this idea going by having Pomni attempt to sneak one of them into the circus or something, but that never happened, so it's legit just dropped. Really, the only tangible threat before episode 8 is the concept of abstraction, but after episode 1, it's not even hinted at as a possibility until episode 6 with Jax, or I guess episode 4 with Gangle, maybe?
I forgot about episode 2 with Pomni because it's so badly integrated into that episode.
And one doesn't come back much before the finale while the other doesn't come back at all, so it's hardly a good substitute. Though, there's definitely a world where it could have been. Like, I remember back in the early days of the fandom, there was a ton of hype wondering who would abstract next or how, usually through Jax. And though at the time that was probably because up to that point, abstractions were the only thing we knew that could hurt them, I feel like they could also have been a great way to introduce drama. I mean, how many people subconsciously pictured the fallout of Jax accidentally making Gangle abstract, or Ragatha? It just sounds like something the story do, and it seemed like a what if that would force Jax to reflect while alienating him from the group, maybe inspiring a debate about whether they can leave him behind or not. But that debate doesn't happen since outside of flashbacks, no one but Jax abstracts, so from that angle, the drama's still mostly untapped. And it's not the first time the show's had a setup for something but then didn't follow through, since there's actually a lot of stuff that seems like it's giving hints at having a deeper explanation only for it to mean nothing later. Like, why did Pomni freak out over seeing the computer? What made Kaufmo abstract? Why does everyone's avatar represent something about them? All of these seem like really valid things to ask, and yet even when we learn about all their pasts, about who Kaufmo was, about how Kane was made, none of these questions get any satisfying answers. They're left for us to speculate. And it'd be one thing if those ideas were just lingering in the background, but it actively gets us to wonder about them, so I can't help feeling disappointed when nothing comes of it. And it also sort of hints to something I haven't heard anyone mention before, but seems pretty obvious when you go through it all, which is that Circus was probably a work in progress. You know, some parts were definitely planned from the beginning, the vibe, the world, the backstories, the everything with Jax. Doesn't take much to see those were thought up from the start. This sketch of Pomni's unicorn horn is all the proof I need for that, but I'm not sure how much anything else was. Granted, a lot of it probably comes down to the glitch model, which means the pilot also has to be the first episode, a model I've just never agreed with since a pilot and first episode serve two vastly different things. A pilot, it's supposed to sell a network on why they should pick up a show, which means usually it's about introducing the cast, the world, what a day in the life is, but the first episode, that tends to be sort of looser. It can focus more on setup and leaving plot threads since it's already planned. And I don't know how Stuff at Glitch works, maybe they greenlight the whole thing in advance and just call it a pilot. From what I can tell, they seem to let it out in the wild before deciding on more episodes, and I'm inclined to believe that's how it is since, goddamn, in retrospect, some of the pilot's choices don't make any sense. Like, if Kaufmo and his death meant so much to everyone, how come none of them give a fuck right as it's happening? If Kane's always listening in, why doesn't he help Pomni when she calls out for him? If the whole circus space was meant to be used, why does the cast never go to the carnival? The easy answer is that was probably all decided after a full series was greenlit, and that's another big problem with this model, cause a pilot is also supposed to be kind of a test run, where you can work out the bugs and learn from mistakes before the final thing, but when that just is the final thing, it leads to all these inconsistencies, since your priorities are fundamentally different, though admittedly that's not where the changes stop, since going from episode to episode, it's clear Goose was feeling out how to structure them. It's part of what I meant when I said going back through the thing was kind of rough, because especially early on, you can feel that amateur screenwriter vibe from Goose, and I'm not saying that as an insult, I'm just calling it what it is. Since so far up to this point, most of her work was short, self-contained stories without any dialogue, and hey, being as fair as I can, that's very impressive. Most storytellers are kinda ass at those things. But when it's all you've worked on so far, it can make the transition to longer, episodic, convo-heavy storytelling kinda hard. And in the early episodes, I feel that strain. Like, they don't manage their time efficiently at all. The way they almost always separate Pomni from the group when she's supposed to be establishing bonds as they go off on unrelated B-plots, so fucking frustrating. I mean, I know I mentioned it before, but seriously, how are you gonna spend the second episode, one that's supposed to show how Pomni saved from falling into darkness by the other circus members, with her completely away from them getting close to a character who's never that important again? How do you spend your third and fourth episodes highlighting one character at a time while leaving the rest out to dry? It legitimately feels like Goose didn't know what to do with the time at first, and that's reflected in how disproportionate the screen time for each character is in the first 4 episodes. There's no balance to it, and even though it gets better starting episode 5, it's still not that great, and obviously I could prove that through how much the finale's just devoted to Jax in the end, but it's more telling to me how little it feels like the other characters got, despite how, when you tally it up, it's way more balanced than you'd think. You know, technically speaking, Gangle, Zubul, Ragatha, Kinger, excluding the finale, their screen time isn't that much less than whatever Jax got. The only difference is that one of them's an instigator and the others aren't. So while one's out here getting shit done, making use of his time, the others are just sulking around or playing along till he comes around, and that makes our time with them way less meaningful than it was with him. A fact that becomes way too on the nose when a certain moment hits in the finale. See, I've been trying not to mention the finale too much, mostly because if everything lines up how it should, which it probably won't, this will come out around when it's released on YouTube, so I don't currently have much footage to show with it, but there's one really important moment I've just gotta talk about, and that's when after the cast all find out what their real-life counterparts are doing, Kane asks something to Pomni while calling her by her real name, and since we found out they're all just data of these people's brain scans brought to life in the circus, she says something along the lines of, she's out there doing her own stuff, but I'm just Pomni. And when you hear that by itself, it sounds profound. Like she's had these experiences that molded her into something different from her real-world self to the point that now she pretty much feels like a new person. It's a great concept. In theory. But when I look back on Pomni's big moments over the series and her character in the grand scheme of things, I don't feel like I've gotten a good profile of her as a person, and I definitely don't feel like she's developed over time to where now she's unrecognizable from where she started. Not at all. If anything, she's too much like her pilot self. Everyone is. Because remember, Jax and I guess at the end Kane are the only ones who've gotten actual major developments that were the main focus of the narrative. The only thing most of the others have is, well, moments. And that might be part of what held it back for me, since, like I said at the start, Goose knows how to make a scene hit, whether it's through great music or framing or some killer symbolism, but now that I think about it, most of those moments in Digital Circus come off kind of forced. Like the entire episodes they came from were all about setting up those moments. They don't feel like the natural endpoint of stories or wherever they're supposed to be from. They feel like scenes Goose knew would be powerful when they happened, but hadn't quite planned out the setup for when she came up with them. So divorced from anything else, they're powerful and stick with you after the show, but in context, they're sort of clunky or less deep than they think they are. Like, did Kinger and Pomni walking through the hall really warrant this beautiful piano ballad like it's this moving, impactful scene? Does Pomni leaving the void with Gummy Goo deserve this ethereal track while they smile like they've been on a journey together? Shit, even the end of the pilot seems a bit sudden for its grand, revelatory statement about Pomni being forced to embrace the madness. But maybe that's my problem. I could never get caught up in the grandness of it. To me, it's always just been Goose's first attempt at a show, and she got better as she went. There's some real marked improvements in the dialogue, tension, developments, and direction, especially in the last few episodes, but that first half really taints the second in ways that highlight the show's issues as a whole the longer it goes on. Problems with focus, payoff, meaningful screen time, conflict and resolution. I want to give Goose the credit she deserves for this, since she clearly channeled a bunch of themes through shit she dealt with personally, and there's a lot to commend in that vulnerability, but I think the best thing I can do as someone who's loved her work for as long as I have is to be fully honest about how I feel and hope it can do something to help her in whatever project she decides to do next, since I know she's got way more to offer the world with her weird brand of creativity. Whether that's something big or small, I don't know. She's probably not hankering for this level of stressful popularity again anytime soon, but it's hard to think a mind like hers would slow down even if it's a factor. I didn't think this show was amazing, but I'm hopeful for the future. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some stairs to take.